During the 1900s, anarchism was a terror of many of the financial, social, and economic elites. And then it somewhat faded away, but it never entirely vanished. During the Occupy Wall Street movement, anarchists in various forms reappeared again, and now in the current political climate, we see some anarchists returning. And just as with fascism, it's important to look at what anarchism is, because of course you get people throwing the term around, talking about these anarchists and using it as a term of attack. And so we should look at the philosophical underpinnings of anarchism. Now, anarchism was and is a very broad movement. There is no single pure anarchist ideology where you can look and say, if someone's an anarchist, they believe exactly these things. But there's sort of a core belief system to anarchy that would make it anarchism. And if people go too far from that, then in some ways would cease to be anarchist. But with all philosophical views and ideologies, there's always the debate about who gets to define it. Now, one approach to take, which I took in the case of fascism, is to look at the history of a particular ideology, a philosophical view, how the term was used, and look at reasons to define it in a particular way. So in part is sort of the historical foundations of it, defining it, and looking at the core concepts. And as Locke noted, we can use our words however we wish. We can call anything anarchism, but if we're going to have a meaningful conversation, we have to sort of set some standards as to what we mean by these terms. And Emma Goldman is one of the paradigm anarchists, and so it's reasonable to take her as defining what anarchism is, at least a certain version of it. So a little background for Emma Goldman. She was born June 27th, 1869, in Lithuania. She died May 14th, 1940, and is of course still dead today. She immigrated to the United States in 1886, was deported to Russia, and was there during the Russian Revolution. She also lived in France. She was quite active. She was imprisoned in 1893 for urging unemployed workers to ask for work. If they do not give you work, ask for bread. If they do not give you work or bread, take bread. On September 10th, 1901, she was arrested on charges of conspiracy to assassinate President McKinley. She was involved in birth control. On February 11th, 1916, she was arrested and imprisoned for distributing birth control literature. Because this may sound odd to people today, but distributing birth control literature was a crime then. And it's worth considering the history of birth control in the United States to look at notions of liberty. In 1917, she was arrested for conspiring to obstruct the draft. In 1936, she was involved in the Spanish Civil War as the English language representative in London for the CNT FAI. And so a very active life. Her three main works include Living My Life, her autobiography, My Disillusionment in Russia, and Anarchism and Other Essays. And we'll look at her most famous work, Anarchism. So, what is anarchism? Now, she begins right off the bat by considering the opposition to anarchism before actually defining it. And as you might imagine, when people hear terms like anarchy and anarchism, it's sort of instinctive for most people to be critical of it, to be worried about anarchism. Now, one of the standard objections to anarchism is that it is impractical. Now, before getting to her definition, the general view of anarchism, as a political theory, is this. Anarchy is not about chaos, although it's often combined with, chaos. It's a view that there should be no government. Essentially, that's its main thing. It's literally, we have things like, fascism, communism, and anarchism is the view that there should be no government. Now, as you might imagine, the first objection that it's impractical is appealing to many people, because it does seem impractical. So if someone says, if we have no government, what are we going to do? Now, you might have heard calls in the recent protest to defund the police. And although that's not, saying to defund the police is not like pure anarchism, the similar objection is made against it that's made to anarchism, essentially, which is, if you have no police, how do you maintain order? That's so impractical. Second argument against anarchism is that it stands for violence and destruction, so it must be repudiated as vile and dangerous. Now, we see this today, even though anarchists are not as common as they were, back in the heyday of anarchism. They're still around, they still show up at protests, and Antifa, the anti-fascist group, is often, sort of lumped in with anarchist. And they're typically accused of being violent and destructive, throwing bottles, burning buildings, etc. So how does Goldman respond to these objections, that it's impractical and that it's violent? Well, her response to the first objection is this, and it's something well worth considering, because every time someone proposes a change to our system, there's always people who leap in and say, that's just impractical. That just couldn't be. Now, a person could make an argument as to why something's impractical, but simply asserting it's impractical and throwing out some insulting memes or gifs doesn't make the argument. So she turns to our good dead friend Oscar Wilde. Wilde said that people define a practical scheme as one that already exists or could be carried out under existing conditions. Roughly put, that people regard as practical what is already existing or what requires no change. So that people essentially regard as practical what we're doing, not requiring any change. So anything requiring change would be seen as impractical. Now, Goldman says she's objecting to the existing conditions, and any scheme that could accept them she regards as wrong and foolish. So what does she think should be the true standard for being practical? Well, she says this: it's got to have vitality enough to build and sustain new life. Somewhat vague, but that's what she claims. And she claims that anarchism is actually more practical than any other idea, because it helps do away, she claims, with the wrong and foolish. She claims it helps build and sustain new life, or so she claims. And so again, this is a practical challenge for any opposition to the current system. Whenever one opposes the current system, a standard objection is that's impractical. And so if you believe in changing a current system, you pretty much always will have to face that objection. So what's her reply to the second objection, the violence objection? Well, there are some peaceful anarchists. For example, our good dead friend Henry David Thoreau, who originated the notion of civil disobedience, although he didn't have any real success with it. It was adopted later by Gandhi, and then made its way back to the United States with Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., in which case it was successful. And so there are anarchists who oppose violence and would not engage in violence. Goldman takes a different view. Goldman says that ordinary people don't know that the most violent element in society is ignorance. And that is what anarchism, she claims, is combating. So she actually embraces the violence. She says that anarchism destroys only parasitic growths, feeding on the life of society. It clears soil from weeds and sagebrush, that it may bear healthy fruit. And so, roughly put, under that somewhat poetic language, she seems to be echoing the words of the character played by Arnold Schwarzenegger in the movie True Lies. In True Lies, spoilers, Arnold is a secret agent, hiding it from his wife. She thinks he's up to something else. And so she gives him like a truth serum and, asks him questions and says, one of the questions she asked him is, did you ever kill people? And he says, yes, but they were all bad. And essentially, put crudely, Goldman is saying that. When she says it destroys only parasitic growths, feeding on the life of society, she could be taken as saying that, yes, anarchism is violent, but those that it's taking care of are bad. And this, of course, leads to the moral debate about what are the moral acceptable applications of violence. Can you use it to bring about social change, to fight against oppression? Now, we know, of course, for a fact that people who maintain order and want to maintain, the existing status quo are perfectly fine with violence. And one could make a consistency argument. If violence is perfectly acceptable to use in maintaining an existing order, then it would seem that violence would also be acceptable to change that order. But of course, people who want to defend the order would be outraged if violence used against them. But the challenge is arguing why violence in defense is acceptable and violence against is not. So what is anarchism itself? Because he's defended it without actually saying what it is. And so let us take a look at what Goldman regards anarchy or anarchism to be. So the nature of anarchism. According to Goldman, here's the idea. Again, anarchism is about having no government. So she takes it to be a philosophy of a social order. So again, she claims it's not chaos. And it's going to be based on liberty, unrestricted by man-made law. So why? Why this? Well, anarchists generally accept that all government rests on violence, and this makes them wrong, harmful, and unnecessary. And so she sees there being two elements, the individual instincts and social instincts. And she claims that they are, closely related. And what has happened is that individual and society have battled for supremacy. And anarchism, she claims, solves that it brings to humans the consciousness of themselves. And, well, what follows, of course, shows why anarchism was greatly feared and is still feared today. Because many anarchists, but not all, claim that God, the state, and society are non-existent, and their promise is void since they are fulfilled only by subordination of people. Now, anarchists don't have to be atheists, but many anarchists are. So anarchism, at least according to Goldman, claims there's no conflict between individual and social instincts, no more so than there's conflict, to use her analogy, between heart and lungs. So essentially, anarchism, on her view, is the removal of government, which she regards as resting fundamentally on violence. Now, she does, as you'll note, talk about it being a social order. So anarchy is not a lack of order, it's a lack of violent government. So what does she regard as the problems that anarchy is going to fix? Well, and this is also why anarchism was and still is regarded as, a terrible threat by some, perhaps even many. So, in terms of the dangerous or pernicious, harmful influences, one for at least Emma Goldman's version of anarchism is religion. And again, not all anarchists are anti-religion, and so this is not like a core requirement to being an anarchist. You don't have to be like an anti-religion atheist. So anarchism, according to Goldman, liberates people from the phantoms that have held them captive. And so the idea she takes it to be is that anarchism is going to, essentially declare war on these pernicious influences, defeat them, and free people. And so the three are religion, which she regards as, dominating the human mind, property, which is dominating human needs, and government, dominating human conduct. Now, in the case of government, all anarchists would have to be against government by definition. But in terms of religion, different matter. Property, also, maybe they have to be against it, but it would be a matter of debate. But fundamentally, anarchists all have to be against government. So what about this fight with the religion? Well, according to Goldman, religion dominates us, humiliates us, degrades us, making God everything and us nothing. And she claims, in a very anti-religious view, that from this nothing, God created a kingdom so despotic, only gloom, tears, and blood have ruled the world since. And she thinks that anarchism aims to be rid of that, anti-religious. And so the first thing she thinks anarchism will get rid of is religion. And once again, anarchists do not have to be atheists because it's not core to anarchism itself, but many anarchists are anti-religious because they regard it as a tool of oppression against the people. The second pernicious influence is property. Now, when anarchists or socialists, etc., talk about property, the usual kind of straw man attack against them is that they mean that you won't be able to own your own toothbrush, your own underwear, and I guess everyone will be brushing their teeth with the same toothbrush, and everyone sharing underwear. That's not what the anarchist and Marxist and socialist believe. I'm not claiming that none of them believe that, because there's always somebody who believes something. But their view of property is not they're going to eliminate your toothbrush or your underwear. Their view is this: that they regard property as a domination of our needs and the denial of our right to satisfy our needs. And these criticisms that anarchists raise, well, if you followed like Occupy Wall Street and general, kind of criticisms from the left, the idea is that this system of property, we could call it our current capitalist system, is regarded as insatiable, devouring, devastating. Now, there are many anarchists talking about property. It's kind of a big thing for them. But again, the main thing for them is the government. But property is also a main factor. And this, of course, is, as you might imagine, why anarchists are often regarded with great terror by people who are, rich and well off, because the anarchists who are concerned about, property, they're clearly targeting the top, the 1%. Now, there is a famous French anarchist called Proudhon, and he said famously that property is theft. Now, this, of course, seems like a bit of a paradox, because theft requires you're taking something that belongs to somebody, which is property. So it's like saying if property is theft, then what could that mean? So problematic. But the way they kind of sort this out is this. In this case, they don't mean property. Again, it's not your toothbrush, your underwear, your laptop. It's property in the sense of what we would call capitalism. And so Goldman's concern, and anarchists like Proudhon, are that, monopoly, essentially, one main concern, that, it has made most people, paupers and outcasts. Now, at one time, of course, the excuse could be made that we don't make enough to satisfy everyone's needs. We don't have the resources to do this. So there have to be people who are poor and lacking because we simply don't have the agricultural, the manufacturing quality to do so. And perhaps historically at times that was true. We perhaps had more people than we could sustain with our ability to produce. Even that, of course, could be debated. But as Goldman points out correctly, that property, as she defines it, lacks the excuse that we do not create enough, because the productivity of labor then, and clearly now, exceeds all normal demand. For example, during this pandemic, there are people who, are having trouble, buying food, and yet we have an excess of food. The government was buying up, as it's done in the past, buying up food because there's too much. And so the idea that we don't have enough food, we don't have enough buildings, we don't have enough resources is just objectively, false. So the anarchists are right about this. As the anarchists claim, it's just that not everyone has the money to buy the resources that are readily available. So it's not a shortage of lack, it's a shortage of not being able to pay what those who control it want to pay, which would be a kind of an anarchist thing to say. And so again, they're very critical of this concept of property, that the only demand property recognizes is its appetite for greater wealth, because wealth is power. The power to subdue, crush, exploit, enslave, outrage, and degrade. So as you can see, the anarchists are very critical. And if you followed, criticisms from the left about our current economic system, these will sound very familiar. So what did the anarchists offer in return? Because one thing that Goldman does is, instead of just saying, oh, this is all, terrible, she does try to offer a positive alternative, which is, you could argue, is perhaps a moral responsibility. If one is going to tear down a system, to put something hopefully better in its place. And it is a bit poetic. She claims that real wealth consists in things of utility and beauty that help create strong, beautiful bodies and inspiring surroundings, and that we now just give the world gray and hideous things, reflecting a dull and hideous existence. Now, anarchists, and many on the left, are often criticized for being often, kind of poetical about these things, talking about gray and hideous things and talking about beauty, as opposed to being very practical. And of course, there are practical concerns. How would you change and replace the existing system of economic, relationships? How would you alter capitalism in ways that would make it better? Unless, of course, one believes that capitalism has achieved the pinnacle of perfection and cannot be improved in any possible way. So one of the main foes for Goldman is this property. And again, it's not the straw man attack of, they're going to take away your toothbrush and your underwear and such. It's property, in terms of the whole economic system. Now, Goldman is also concerned about what she calls, machine subservience and centralization. Now, back when she was anarching, it was, of course, relatively, compared to today, low tech, 1900s. But now, of course, we have, computers and robots and so forth. But what she's talking about when she talks about machine subservience is not a science fiction scenario where the robots have taken over, but her view is essentially as we are acting like machines and we are working to service machines. And her words are even more relevant today because we work on computers. A good example is like in the Amazon warehouses that people have these devices they carry that essentially just direct them around. It's like they're the robot and the device is commanding them. And so she says if we continue with this, our slavery will be more complete than bondage to a king. She's also concerned about centralization. Now, this is one area where the anarchists and some people on the right, like libertarians, do agree. And libertarians, their view is in some ways similar to anarchism. They want to really minimize government and, decentralize it and keep it small. So you can imagine anarchists and libertarians agreeing on a lot of stuff like, yes, we must have really small government. And so they oppose centralization. Why? Well, she claims it's the death of liberty, health, beauty, art, and sciences, all impossible in a clock-like mechanical atmosphere. So essentially she's contending against, in the 1940s, kind of the factory scenario, people just laboring away, controlled by a centralized economy. And today, of course, she'd probably offer similar criticism of our, big mega corporations where people just toiled in service to these corporations and the billionaires that run them. So what is anarchism going to do? Again, she's got to offer something positive. Those who just simply tear into things and attack things and offer nothing in its place, well, they're only doing half the job. So what she wants is this. She wants to get rid of the system that dominated her in her time. And today we'd say, of course, getting rid of the capitalism we have now. And offering, and again, a common criticism of the left is it's often very poetical. So her goal is the freest possible expression of all latent powers of the individual. And she quotes Oscar Wilde again, who says that a perfect personality is one who develops under perfect conditions, who is not wounded, maimed, or in danger. And she believes, and there are others who make this argument, that we can only have a perfect personality when we are free to choose the mode, conditions, and freedom to work. And this is arguments made by many on the left, that essentially being forced to toil and labor so that people like Jeff Bezos or Bill Gates can pile up more money is damaging to people. So what did the anarchists offer in this place? Well, again, they're often dinged for seeming to have these sort of idealist views, but this is what they claim. If you're in the anarchist ideal, for you, work would be the result of your inspiration, intense longing, and deep interest in work as a creative force. In other words, you'd be doing what you love for real. I mean, we have sayings today like, do what you love and you'll never work a day in your life. What the anarchists are saying is you will be able to do what you love. Instead of being compelled to labor to avoid, starving and being homeless and losing everything, you would labor because it is what you love to do. So how will they bring about all this? Well, what the anarchists claim is there will be voluntary, productive, and distributive associations, gradually developing into free communism. And as you might imagine, those are serious trigger words for those who currently control the economic system. And so the idea would be, instead of being compelled, forced by, essentially economic lack and forced into economic servitude, people would voluntarily form these associations. And the anarchist claims that people have a right to work in harmony with your taste and desires. So what she's asserting is that you would be able to do the work that you love, and there would be no more economic compulsion. Now, as you might imagine, there are many stock objections against this. One is, of course, that if people are not compelled and forced with threat of starvation and being evicted, they would not labor. Kind of the laziness argument. People would just be takers and not makers. And it is an empirical question. Would people do that? A second objection is, well, there are all kinds of tasks that no one loves. For example, think of all the jobs that people generally probably wouldn't do if they weren't had few or no other options. Who would work all the jobs of cleaning the sewers? Who would clean the toilets at in stadiums? Who would sweep the streets? Who would make burgers for people? Who among us would love just laboring in a factory, making widgets? But all many of these things are necessary. Taking care of the trash, cleaning the streets, cleaning the bathrooms, making food, picking food. And if people had a free choice, who would be out in a hot field, raking blueberries or picking tomatoes? And so kind of the challenge is, if we don't have a compulsive system that, punishes people and compels them to work horribly bad jobs, then we wouldn't have this stuff done. And that is a fair point, because every society faces the challenge of how do you get people to do the crappy jobs? And currently we rely on economic coercion. Essentially, if you don't work the crap jobs, you don't get paid, you don't have a place to live, you don't have food, so you suffer. But perhaps there are other alternatives to this. One thing that people advanced, of course, is technological advancement, that the crap jobs can be taken over by the robots. But of course, that's how we get the robot revolution, and they kill us all. Spoiler alert, they do kill us all 2024. That's how it goes down. I'm sorry, spoilers. So that's what the anarchists claim. And again, the standard criticism is that this is just unrealistic, that you can't have a system where people just do what they love to do. That's just impossible. You've always got to have a system where people are compelled to labor to take care of all the crap jobs. Now, the next pernicious influence for the anarchist is the state.